Hello, beautiful community. Let me know if you are hearing me. Happy Sunday to you all. Let me know if I am audible. Hello, everybody. People are hearing me. Let me see if this beautiful Kenyan pour over coffee I made. Everybody is hearing me. Let me do a microscopic bit of scrolling up and see what questions were left upstairs as people were waiting. It's Sunday. I think we've just seen a video from Perun drop about cluster munitions. And I think I look forward to seeing that, actually. It's such a funny business, this YouTube business, because there is such a thing as good content, and there is also such a thing as good YouTube content, and they're always the same thing. You can do something really, really good, but it doesn't quite go because it's not YouTube good. And so no matter how reluctant you are about it, you've got to understand that you've got to be good, but you also got to be at least a bit YouTube good. And so one of the things we sometimes miss about creators like Perun is how YouTube good these videos are. Not just how good they are, but how YouTube good they are and how hard that is to do. Sometimes you can do whatever you want if you've built up enormous credit with the algorithm. Actually, I listened to an quite a long, which is very rare for me because of my health limitations, but I listened to quite a long written essay, really, that Adam Ragusa read out about Gordon Ramsay, the chef. And it was beautiful, but you need a lot of YouTube credit and a very big, deep community to get away with that. So it's always a fascinating conversation being YouTube good. And we sometimes underestimate how much that takes. Let's go. I saw a question upstairs about the meaning of life. For some reason, this does not let me scroll all the way up at the moment. I think the chat channels functionality is less than the main channels. They add some extra functionality, I think, if you've got over 100,000 subscribers. I saw a question there, Vlad, what is the meaning of life? And now it's gone. So let me try to answer it. And it's from one of the regular members of the beautiful community. So the point of life is to become a member of the beautiful community. That's the most important thing about life. So as long as you belong to the beautiful community, that hopefully indicates that your life will have a lot of meaning. And if you don't, you're obviously missing out. I think that's the main philosophical ingredient of a good life. But actually, what a good life is connected with the question of death, with the question of what it means to die well, right? And later today, on the microscopic philosophy channel, I'm going to release a very gentle, slow video about the meaning of death and my views about it, covering not just death itself, but also disability and suicide and what it means to time a life. Because what we're looking for fundamentally is a situation whereby we can be lucky enough to say at the end of a life, if I died now, that would be okay, if not even right or appropriate. So reaching a stage where you say it would be okay if I died now is a product of a life well lived and a life well timed and a life luckily lived and luckily timed. Something else that's very important in our culture that we really struggle with so badly is authenticity. You remember how often I talk about the gamification of this, the toxic discourse of that, the narcissistic engagement with that, the mixed motive tagging along to cause XYZ. What is all of that stuff? It's authenticity. It's authenticity. It's the expression of the value of authenticity. It's just that in our culture, 98% of the expressions of the value of authenticity are bogus. But that doesn't mean that they are not distortions of a real thing and of a good thing. Yeah? One of the things that's happening in our culture today is that there is a great deal of group quest and insistence on recognition. And that's a good thing in principle, but the form in which it takes in our society is unsustainable and extreme. It'll inevitably collapse. But that doesn't mean that all of it is based on a value that's bogus, right? A value that's a little bit distorted in practice isn't because of that a less real value. And therefore, the conservative critiques of the value of authenticity that have been such a big part of our culture that have often accused, as it were, authenticity of just being a cover for narcissism. Right? These conservative critiques are indeed missing the fact that authenticity is nearly the main value in our society, certainly in the West. And authenticity is, as Nietzsche would say, becoming who one is. Right? So becoming who one is a very big part of the meaning of life. Let me now see what else is going on. I just saw a question from, um, was it from Ross, about whether I would be doing this if I didn't have my sickness, if I didn't have my myalgic encephalomyelitis. The answer is paradoxical, actually. So if I didn't have ME, I'd be well known for academic work first, and I'd be coming to be a bit better known for public work second. This pattern is obviously radically slowed down by my health, and it's a bit reversed. So we've got a weird situation where I'm doing quite a bit of public work, but because of my damn health, private work, my non-public intellectual work is a little bit behind. And if my life goes well, then these two will have the opportunity to even out. But it's so hard with such a limited time, which means that we have to build um, this conversation further, and I have to build a kind of structure whereby I can outsource a maximal number of things that I'm not best at doing anyway. I'm still doing everything myself, but over time this has to change, and there are different mechanisms for that. One of them is, of course, uh, Patreon, and I know some of you are there. Um, and it was very kind of Perun to recently point out that he is there too. Let's have a look. Hi to everybody. I'm seeing so many familiar faces. I'm seeing faces, but of course, they are just my imagination. Um, Ross is asking again, is there a video you can make about this business of you saying that Putin intends to challenge NATO in the late 2020s? What evidence is there for this conclusion? It's a wonderful question. This point is unoriginal. This is a point that Greg Uden makes more elaborately than I do. But if you were to say what's the evidence for it, I'm not sure that would be the right way to start that conversation, because it's such an interpretive question, right? We're interpreting both the directionality of these broken institutions of the Russian state and of the Putin regime, but also interpreting the intentions in the minds of individuals. But if you were to say, well, start with evidence, we would begin with the ultimatum that the Putin regime gave the West before the war. And that was not about Ukraine. It was about a realignment of the international order that essentially amounted to the disappearance of NATO. Did they mean it? Was it BS? I mean, what they were asking for was BS in the sense that it was completely ungivable to them. But did they mean it? I think they meant it. And I think they still mean it. And I think they still think that our stuff is going to fall apart and they'll be able to walk in and claim what's theirs, which is all of Eastern Europe. Um, It'd have to be a bit of a remarkable comeback for Putin to be able to do that. But he thinks he's 2 goals down at halftime. He can win 3-2. Teams have won from 3-0 down at halftime. So, Vanessa, hi. Um, do I have family close by? Do I have a good support system? So, um, I don't have a good support system in the sense that with my condition, when I am down, sort of managing symptoms and trying to galvanize myself for a bit of work, a bit of functionality, the best thing I need is appropriate sort of actually alone solitary time. So from a practical point of view, I don't have a practical support system, but of course I have an emotional support system. I recently spent some time with my family actually in the UK. They're a bit dispersed. And my little sister, hi Annie, if you are watching, lives in Portugal. And it's weird because Annie is completely British. Like Annie does not have in any way a Russian accent. She left the Soviet Union when she was 1. She's completely British. And I feel that that's quite interesting. So I mean, when I ask myself a question, well, how far am I actually Russian? My little sister is quite a bit less Russian than me. In fact, she's probably not Russian at all. Hi, Rachel. Well done for managing your crisis. Um, Let me scroll down. Stapedius, I butcher everybody's name. I try to improve. How genuine is the libertarian um, um, how genuine is the libertarian conservative pro-Russia trend? Can it become the mainstream of the US Republican Party? I do believe Putin will become more popular in the West, um, unless something catastrophic happens to his regime, which might. But I think that sort of right trend for Putin isn't a Putin trend, it's an anti-Putin trend. And therefore, it's a certain reaction to what is happening in America. Just like left soft on Putin attitude are in fact a form of anti-Americanism, so right soft on Putin attitudes are also attitudes that are really anti-American in the sense that they're anti-stuff happening in the United States. Um, Now, there is a psychological platform that is available for citizens, which says, my institutions here are so broken, so corrupt, they're betraying me so much that we need somebody who can come in and do it proper like Mr. Putin. But of course, all of that soft and Putin stuff is not predicated on much knowledge of Russia. As soon as you begin to know more about the Putin regime, you progressively dislike it. I'm afraid to say. There was a question at the beginning that I also just recalled about the causes of the crisis of trust. And we're going to talk about that separately. But I trace a kind of crisis of trust to the early 1970s in the Western world, and a process whereby people's access to politics evaporated. People sense that the mechanics of politics are transparent to them, are understandable by them, are working for them. That sense has been evaporating since the early 70s. That evaporation has been accelerated by many social forces, economic forces, the interactions between um, economic and political dynamics, political social fluidity, various kinds of policies that could be described as neoliberal. I don't use that term like that. The the presence of the social media, various general conditions of the modern world. Um, you can add all of these things, and we will put all of this together. And what you get is a kind of untethering of the social fabric, whereby we just have a huge crisis of solidarity and public good, and only a partial rejuvenation that is bottom up of democracy could slow this trend down. I promise we'll be going there. But what is important as a placeholder until we go there is to understand that this um, dissolution of the social fabric um, mm, is produced by social forces and not idiot voters who are ignorant and misinformed victims of disinformation and misinformation. So that's very, very important. And in fact, the key issue, right, with let's say a Trump voter who thinks that Trump won in 2020 is not disinformation. It's part of this dynamic of the crisis of trust, right? And the situation whereby there are social forces that bring it about, that people can't feel their political agency at all and acknowledge the truth at the same time. It's not people's fault that in our social environment, agency and truth clash. We're going to be talking, Jan, we're going to be talking about tips as well about how to prevent um, this democratic slide. And of course, we have to watch for political forces that are there, as I put it, to break the democratic game. Um, sometimes they're out there to do that intentionally, and sometimes they're not. What's fascinating about the soft on Putin populist right and soft on Putin bit to the left is that the Putin regime spends a lot of time trying to enamor itself with the populist right, but actually has invests virtually nothing in trying to engage with the soft on Putin left. That's fascinating. I actually think it's got more potential to exploit that than it's currently doing. YouTube is fascinating. Yesterday, or the day before when we did a live, we had half of the number of people we usually have, which was about 1,000, under 1,000. And now we have half of the number that is usual for Sundays. So we've got about 400, 500. Um, interesting. Interesting. I wonder what is going on. It could be algorithm, and that's fascinating because we tend to think that what happened on Twitter is just a sort of a one-off, and it's got nothing to do with um, uh, YouTube. But you see, any platform is vulnerable to a particular kind of transformation, right? A little algorithmic nudge could have somebody's views triple or somebody's views 3x downward. Um, and we don't even know why, right? So imagine that on YouTube, certain content on the Ukraine war was 3x boosted and 3x deboosted. If a politician came along and said, okay, let's just assume that it is going to go the way you've done it, dear Google. Can I at least see why and what the mechanisms are and see if the mechanisms are sort of procedurally okay for me? And the answer at the moment to that question is no, we're not going to tell you, and we don't even know ourselves. Right? So this is a question, basic question about the democratization um, of the internet. Yeah, no, I'm talking about a regular, a sort of a regular number for exactly this time of the day for this channel. French, you're talking about the right now. Don't you think many politicians who believe in neoliberal magical thinking are delusional about what neoliberalism has brought about? Macron being an example. So let's retranslate that question. Do I think that magical thinking about the market, and that's to say, not prioritizing the market where we think the market should take priority, not uh, uh, prioritizing non-market solutions where we think they should take priority, but rather going about which one you prioritize with a bit of magical thinking and assuming that you don't even need reasons to prioritize the market. It's always magically best. Has that kind of assumption played a role in the crisis of trust that we have gathered up? A bit, yes. And that creates a fascinating thing, which of course is that centrist politics, for better or worse, of the kind we've had in the 90s and the early 2000s, is itself responsive for the wave of populist disruption that we're experiencing, right? So when Hillary says the deplorables, the answer comes back, how did we come about? How did the situation come about that that's how many citizens feel? And what's that got to do with your husband's presidency, right? Um, that's a question that's insufficiently deeply asked by these people, actually. And so I think that it's a question where Blair, Obama, and Clinton need to go slower than they're going in understanding the role of their kind of politics. And of course, it's not an easy thing to say their politics should have been different to what it was, but the role of their kind of politics and where we've got, because at the moment we've got too much explanatorily empty bewilderment from the center of politics about what's happening. Oh, this is bad. It must be because citizens have got irrational, because Mr. Farage or Mr. Johnson have said naughty, manipulative things, and because Mr. Putin has done naughty, manipulative interference. And that's why people have gone off the deep end. We just need to return to a kind of normal. But the kind of normal was itself eating up certain um, bits of our society and contributed to where we have got. This is deliberately elusive, the way I've put it, because to get into detail, we need a much longer conversation, and I don't want to overcommit in what I'm saying. It's the Wimbledon final. I apologize for that. I haven't been following tennis for quite some years. I went to Wimbledon twice in 1998 and 1999. And I had strawberries with cream. Alan is asking about the Labour government in Ukraine. For Ukraine, for the foreseeable future, it doesn't matter which of the two parties are in power. Doesn't matter hugely. In other words, support for Ukraine will be sustained. Rachel's asking, was Priami Vlad especially sporty? No, but he was physically unlimited. So yes, and also I don't want to keep you away from the Wimbledon final. So please jump off. The whole point of this is that in half an hour I'm gonna do a very slow edit on my death video, which I think will be one of the two most beautiful videos I've shared, maybe together with a video on the chat channel actually about why I love walking. So I'm going to do that, and we're just here for a very casual, um, uh, very casual conversation. So I do think, Elaine, I do think Professor Kotkin's views are very sound and very wise. He seems to have a capacity to very closely follow the latest events. Um, but it is an interesting question with Stephen how far he's a sort of expert on the contemporary Kremlin, right? I don't know what answer he would give to that, and whether he would feel that some others have a kind of expertise he doesn't, the kind of expertise he might have about, let's say, 20th century Soviet history, that he might not have about the Kremlin today. So I wonder how he weighs his expert hats when it comes to this. Um, I do think I have some disagreement with him, but with fruitful disagreements, it's impossible to place where they begin. So I'm a little bit more gung ho on a Ukrainian victory as something we push toward, I think, than he is. And it's a fascinating conversation about where that difference begins. Um, when Russian soldiers commit atrocities, how can we ethically, tastefully discuss Russia's mistreatment of conscripts and the potential political consequences? Um, Economies of ethical sentiment are plural and conflictive. In society, in relationships, we often fight, but we don't pay attention to intrapersonal conflicts. Very often, when you're fighting with somebody, there is an equivalent of that fight also happening within you, right? There are two voices fighting between you that are perhaps a bit differently settled to the way they are in the other person, but they're there and they do pull in different directions, right? So when you look at the soldiers of an army that are committing atrocities, you should also feel different ethical pulls, right? On the one hand, somebody is committing atrocities. Well, there are levels to this as well, right? There's more or less egregious things that Russian soldiers do. Um, and you can feel that, right? Of course, you're going to feel this very differently if you're in Ukraine and you're Ukrainian, right? But at the same time, you can also feel that there are people who are desperate, reckless, who feel their life is so bad that they're already in a kind of war condition. And then their government comes, tells them something they're not able to question or assess. Then they end up at the front. So of course, perpetrators can be victims too, right? Um, so avoid the cartoonification of Twitter, avoid the gamification of the war. And let me be very, very clear with you. Um, Not a single decent public intellectual will fail to ask you to feel some compassion for the Russian soldiers. Right? If there is a public intellectual out there who asks you to feel none, they're a charlatan, even if they don't know that they are. It's as simple as that, because there's got to be this plurality of economy, plurality of economy. And then you can ask yourself questions like, well, am I going to feel this with a weight of 9 out of 10? Am I going to feel this with a weight of 1 out of 10? So you have to balance the plurality of your ethical economy. And that isn't something that a moral philosopher can prescribe. It needs to be authentic to who you are. right? So that's very important. Um, and you have to balance different things. That these are desperate, desolate people, right? On the other hand, that they're killers, um, engaged in a brutal and completely unprovoked attack backed by genocidal rhetoric, um, and inclusive of a plethora of war crimes, right? That these killers are coming into your home and they're killing your loved ones, right? So you feel unqualified, undifferentiated rage and desire to fully eliminate all of these killers who have appeared, right? There is space for everything, right? It's not either or, it's both. Adam is asking, could the Belarusian opposition have done something more? It's difficult because I think that the starting point of our conversation about Belarus is to give credit, big credit for what happened in 2020 in Belarus, because that completely redefined um, uh, how Belarusians can think about themselves politically, right? They can much more easily than Russians say that they are speaking from the vantage point of a future that is a beyond Lukashenko, beyond dictatorial tyranny future. That mass mobilization in 2020 gives Belarusians that right. It's more complex with Russia. So you have to give massive credit. Um, and it's an irreversibly positive investment into Belarus's political future. Um, and then you're getting into a conversation about at what point and by what means can you challenge regimes. And you've got early onset authoritarian regimes. These are easiest to challenge, right? And you've seen stuff like this. You've seen stuff like this in Israel. You saw stuff like this in 2014 in Ukraine. Not the same, but in some ways in the same bracket. Then you've got highly um, established tyrannies that are very just impossible to challenge. And then you've got what you had in Belarus in 2020, which is a highly established tyranny, not at all an early onset tyranny, but it's beginning to decay. And at what point can you begin challenging and what means are effective? It's an important conversation. Yeah, Ian, I will do something about climate change. I actually have a piece. I think it's a co-written piece that's out about going to be out in some capacity soon about how to balance the plurality, just what we're talking about, the plurality of um, uh, sentiment and the plurality of messaging in climate discourse. Um, I'm skeptical about aliens. Danish is asking, "Hello, Vlad, long-time lurker." There are a lot of lurkers. I mean, in some ways, you know, um, what we do, and I do it myself, right? I just went. I don't do it very often, but I just went into a YouTube video earlier uh, today, and I said, "Look forward to watching this," right? But in a sense, that is so weird. That is weird. That is weird. I mean, so what we're doing here, what I do, just I do what you're doing. It's weird. I mean, I don't do it often enough, but when I drop by creators I'm supportive of, I want to say, go, 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 come on. It's weird. So in a certain sense, the normal default is to be a lurker, not to comment. It's worth acknowledging that actually that there is always with communities thus the community that doesn't speak, and in many ways that is the less weird version than this. Even though, of course, um, you know, without the people who communicate, no community could really exist. Anyway, so lurkers are always very, very welcome. I'm myself a lurker on some platforms I greatly admire. Can you tell me how much Russian public care about Mr. Nevzorov and how big is his influence? I hear his Telegram channel reaches more than Mr. Girkin's. Mr. Nevzorov is got a very mixed past, to say the least. He is a wordsmith, an utterly brilliant wordsmith, and that's why I don't want to judge him. Um, and so I think it'd be inappropriate to judge him. But if you were to judge him, which I think would be inappropriate, you would have to, in the end, for now, categorize him as a Russian who has jumped over into the Ukrainian informational environment and is no longer taking responsibility for the war qua being a Russian and is sort of becoming an honorary Ukrainian. I'm suspicious when that happens, and I'm unimpressed when that happens. Russians have to take responsibility for the war qua Russians. They cannot say, um, oh, you know how I used to be Russian? Russia has just gone so mad. Kind of Ukrainian now. Just, just Ukrainian. Nah, a bit that crazy over there. Yeah. You can get away with that because if all you say is stuff that a small section of the most vocal Ukrainian internet approves of, then you can get away with it. But you're not going to get away with it with me, with the people who are for real. You're not going to get away with this sort of, yeah, I'm an honorary Ukrainian now. I mean, not going to work. But I'm saying you can't accuse Nevzorov of that because he is such a stunningly amoral personality and such a master of the spoken word that you judge him aesthetically in the first and second and third instance. His numbers have been high for a long time. He's got a massive reach, but his reach has dropped recently. Uri Bench, thank you so much for your kind words. DH, I despise the gamification of the world. Yes, I said, look, no large-scale human projects can be achieved without them being achieved via mixed motives. So you can't expect any good cause to be backed up mostly by people with good motives, right? The amount of narcissism in the climate movement is out of control. But some of these narcissists do damage, some of them do good. Something else that I actually love about the climate movement is how many people that are in it who are neurodiverse. And what happens is that, and I don't want to idealize I do not want to idealize having ASD or having autism. I think it's a very challenging, deeply challenging thing. But a lot of people who are on the spectrum have had the capacity to say, even though the whole world is going against this obvious point that's worth making, I'm going to make it anyway because I don't care. It's right. So I'm going to go there. So it's neurodiversity has allowed a lot of people to get onto the right course in climate discourse. But there's a lot of funny stuff going on, right? The same with Ukraine. The amount of toxic grift on the pro-Ukrainian side is just out of control. I'm endlessly receiving private messages asking to comment on it. I don't. There's one thing I will comment on soon, which is this constant linking of sort of Pushkin with Putin. Not literally, but as in Russian culture and Putinism, linking Russian culture and Putinism exhaustively, right? And I never comment on that for the obvious reason that, I'm sorry, if somebody's saying something intellectually sloppy and silly in the process of condemning an utterly outrageous war, for goodness sake, I'm not going to tell them they're intellectually sloppy. But I get the request so much, I will do something little and constructive about it, but it's very hard to balance. Because what do? You have to start that conversation by saying, "Oh my god, Putin has done this, completely outrageous war. Russians are responsible for it. It's, um, beyond outrageous, and our hearts are with Ukraine." And you have to repeat that 23 times before you can point out the intellectual sloppiness. So, it's not a comfortable place to go, but, I will go a bit just to educate us about this conversation. And also, I'm sorry, but how far culture is responsible for political outcomes is a philosophical question. And I don't think you can just sit there and answer it comfortably. If you are um, a dentist or a professor of economics or an accountant or a pianist. So obviously there's going to be sort of a lot of sloppiness, but this is hard to talk about because it just doesn't make sense to start with anything other than just pointing the extraordinary outrage of what we're seeing 700 times before you actually say anything else. But yes, I mean, the commitment that I'm deeply insistent on is truth comes first, and what is progress is derivative from that, not the other way around, right? Our culture is full of the tendency of trying to mold truth, right, into whatever is shape is generated by our ideology of progress. That stuff don't stick. And that stuff don't win the argument for you, except with people who are not themselves, as it were, on the ball. Yes, I have many recommendations for books about political philosophy, but I will be giving those on the philosophy channel. I'm still going to do a big video actually on the chat channel with recommendations for what to follow on Russia. Um, the philosophy channel will be complemented not just with today's video about death. It's coming this evening. I think it just needs a very gentle edit. Suzanne, thank you so much. Um, but I'm hoping to make it 70% a public philosophy channel and 30% a professional philosophy channel. It contains sort of hour-long lectures that are a bit technical. And health allowing, these lectures may overlap with stuff that goes out to philosophy journals. But it'll be a public philosophy channel in the main. And I'm hoping that, as impossible as that feels on 3 hours work time per day, I'll try to make it the best public philosophy channel on the platform. Um, yeah. So I'm going to talk about an article Peter Pomerantsev wrote because there's a terrible dispute between people who say you can't essentialize Russia. You can't say Russians are like this. And people who say, no, Russians are like this. Right? And what I want to say is we have to thread this, right? Because it would be absurd to make essentialist mistakes about Russia that often are just sort of cartoonifications of Ukrainian outrage. But at the same time, you can't say that there's nothing to say about the psychology of a culture in it as you find it in this moment in time, right? There are things that are sick that are part of Russian culture. You can't deny that. And there's plenty of things that are sick here too, but there is worse, right? Different cultures are sick or healthy to different degrees, right? Um, you know, um, there are parts of the Middle East where no human being except weirdos could endure without some without some coming together with PTSD, given all the extraordinary history there. Um, so yeah, we have to talk about this. Um, I mean, let me give you just one, not top three, but one pathology of Russian culture. Um, if you go to Russia, you're going to be struck by how difficult Russians find it to find some things that are constructive and positive in their history. And they're there. They're absolutely there. Absolutely there. Um, but it's hard. Um, Let me give you a positive. Let me give you a sort of a frivolous example, really frivolous, and I'm sorry that it might sort of prioritize the um, um, uh, you know, it might prioritize the male bit of the audience. Um, so, okay, Jake, there's somebody called Jake who's out on a timeout because he's wondering how somebody as stupid as me could possibly have a degree. I don't know. I think that's a fine. That could be a fine question. What do you? I think could be a fine question. I'm probably just fine with that. I think, um, but Russian football is a slum. Um, but in the 90s, it wasn't. There were a great number of talented players in the mid 90s, um, and um, really, really talented players. Um, and just thinking of one, there was one player who was one of the most talented left-sided players, another sense of the left here, in Europe. And remarkably, he never left. And when you talk about Russian football, we're in the 90s, you're not talking about the crazy salaries people in the Russian league are still getting now. We're talking about folks who are getting pretty ordinary salaries in the 90s, and the guy never left. And then he tragically died of a heart failure, heart condition, in his mid 40s a few years ago. Now, if this were in Australia or in Peru or in Norway, the guy would have a statue in a stadium named after him. In Russia, nothing. That is typical, unfortunately. So that's a pathology that Russian culture has. It really struggles to try to leverage its way out of catastrophic places by looking at um, its own evident constructive capacity, right? Um, so um, hmm, that's a generalization. Is it true? It's true. It might cease to be true in 35 years, but it's true today. So we have to balance carefully this business of generalizing, uh, generalizing cultures. People are asking about a victim mentality. So one of the things that Vyacheslav Morozov has shown is that there's a kind of imperialist trend in Russian culture, but there is also a kind of um, trend that's about being oneself colonized, oneself on the wrong end of imperialism. And Russia is both. So there's an imperialist story, but there is also an extraordinary kind of victim story. Um, have a nice day, and so lovely to see you here. Um, so there is both. We're gonna talk about this. That Russia feels somehow colonized, as well as itself having colonizing tendencies. Let's have a look. We're just gonna do 10 minutes more because this was a casual Sunday get together. Alex, I don't understand what on earth you're saying in your comment. It doesn't make sense to me. I don't mean you're wrong. I just don't understand what on earth you're talking about. Um, Justin is saying, so far in this episode, Vlad has demonized Ukrainian proponents and praised Russian culture. Um, so that's very important, as an illustration of um, not thinking for oneself and gamification, right? Sort of what hockey team am I on, right? So it's a very unhealthy comment, right? And that comment indicates that you have an inadequate relationship with your informational environment, in the way you're processing what's coming your way. So this is your comment is a developmental challenge for you, right? Developmental in the sense of how you orientate yourself in the informational environment, right? Um, so um, and of course, one more thing that this sort of fails to get is this basic distinction between what one says and what one feels, what one says and what one thinks, right? I mean, um, I might be, I don't know, having a conversation in which I criticize a town that I particularly like, but of course, cumulatively, I say 9 positive things for one negative thing about it. Um, so the sort of surface fetishizing challenge, right? The surface fetishizing um, sort of self obstruction of saying, well, in this conversation, it's sort of 1-0 against this town, therefore Vlad must have a negative view about this town, right? So um, I I think that's very, very important to challenge, because the thing that Justin is saying is kind of potentially in all of us. It's potentially in all of us. We can come in and sort of tally up what's being said here and say, well, somebody's on the wrong side, and then we become a kind of a Twitter tribunal, right? So 100% challenge to you, Justin, but also an education to us, because you are us too. You're us too, and we have to have this internal dialogue with ourselves. That's really, really very important. So that's my equivalent of what would be a kind of the Trumpian answer here would be nobody supports Ukraine more than me. Yeah. Recently, I've been doing a lot of ROZAMB 0. I do a small number of sort of Zoom events, Zoom interviews, a couple of radio interviews recently. But in principle, there will be um, live events, in-person events too, at some point, um, where some of us can encounter ourselves. I'm also planning to do a couple of sort of events where we can interact online off YouTube. And I'm thinking of what platform is best for that. And I'm thinking that these would be about immediate conversation. Sort of not this where you're typing something and I'm answering, but where you could respond. And I've thought of one platform that has some advantages for that, and that's Clubhouse. Um, I can't do the Trump. Um, I can't do the Trump voice, sadly. Yeah. I hope Justin is not really upset or crying or angry now. Sorry, Justin. We really we meaned on you for 5 minutes. Tiny bit of information about the piano. So the piano is not a piano. The piano you see in the videos. It's a 1910 Bechstein upright. I in the Soviet Union, I grew up with a Bechstein, uh, a grand, a beautiful one from, I think, just the end of the 19th century. Bechsteins were truly marvelous from the 1890s till the 1920s, late 1920s perhaps. And then the factory got bombed out, and that makes modern Bechsteins different. But this one is totally out of tune for health reasons. I don't use it. How would I use it? I would use it to feel under my fingers scores that I am reading. So when I read scores, I could use that, but very little time. But I'm over the course of my life, I'll make some contributions to musicology and music conversations. Um, so that's that. It's just a low quality. It's just a low quality thing. It wouldn't be ethical for me to play the piano in public by playing a piece from beginning to end. But on the music channel, you may unfortunately witness some contact between me and the piano. Um, um, when I demonstrate certain things, but I would never play a piece from beginning to end. That would be unethical of me. Um, and I haven't had any regular contact with the piano except when I read scores, and almost always I read scores away from the piano. But I haven't had regular contact since the 80s. But as a child, from the age of 3 till about 9 or 10, I played the piano every single day for an hour, more than an hour. Why would it be unethical? It would be unethical to um, professional musicians, many of whom are in my life, because the gap with me between my concept of what to do and my capacity to do it is so big that there would be a kind of a trivialization there, right? Um, I am versatility. I too am very tired of zero-sum game politics. I'm 100% pro-Ukraine and America, but don't agree with 100% of what either do, and I'm okay with questioning them, but I'm attacked by many because of it. Uh, we're gonna have a separate conversation about the business of thinking for yourself, right? Justin's comment was a perfect example of not thinking for yourself. And you've got to be careful. Let me just before I even say more about this, and we're coming to the end here, let me just say something really important. First, comments are often sort of casual remarks. They're not things that are typed up in sort of, in stone. They're casual aside remarks often, which is why it's completely. I've often come across comments which say, Vlad, I think you're an idiot. And I say, hi. And they say, yeah, I mean, you just look like an idiot in this video. Love your content, though, generally. It's actually brought a lot of value to me. That happens all the time. So you've got to be careful. Then the second thing you've got to be careful about is you don't know where this is coming from. I mean, you really. I'll be really honest with you. I read a lot of comments, um, and I engage with comments a lot. A bit more than average for people who are full time, and I only work 3 hours a day because of my health. So given that, I spend a huge amount of time engaging with the community, and I never intend to stop that because it's so important. But um, I see so much unhappiness in the comments, so much unhappiness. Um, and you have to be empathetic to that too. I see, of course, there's trolling, and that can be artificial or it can be fun. But I also see a lot of unhappiness, a lot of self destructive commentary, a lot of commentary where somebody's just eating themselves up a little bit. And, in saying that, I'm almost giving myself a kind of a warning about the way I've just done an illustration with Justin's comment, because you've got to be very careful. I mean, that could be somebody who is a young father struggling to keep their stuff together and just emitting stuff online because that just sort of is an activity, just like eating ice cream is an activity, eating too much ice cream. So you've got to be careful about that, you know. Um, um, yeah, but about not taking, about not taking sides, we've got to understand where we're at, right? If you want to do, I mean, it's not illegal to do infowar stuff, right? If you're doing infowar, you're doing infowar, but don't confuse infowar with analysis, right? There's a lot of people who do wonderful infowar work, um, because not all infowar work is unconstructive. There's a lot of sort of propagandists online for good causes who are actually doing a great job, and that call themselves propagandists too. So you got to, we also got to understand people are in different buckets. But what I don't want you to do is to think you are doing sort of cool, sober, um, looking and free thinking for yourself, while you are in fact on a kind of pre-scripted routine, right? So that's the issue. Um, let's have a look. Billy, how should we? We're going to take this last question and then we're going to make some kind of a comment about something, I don't know what, and then we're going to round off and liberate all of you. How should we understand the Kremlin admitting to a meeting between Putin and someone he has denounced? Um, by understanding that despite the betrayal of the mutiny, for Putin, Prigozhin is one of us, the way the military isn't. The military is for Putin an institution of state that he can control, but has to some extent a momentum of its own, and could conceivably betray him. And as it betrays him, if it betrays him, he'd have no capacity to engage with it as a one of us, as a one of me, we could sit across the table with. With Prigozhin, no matter how deeply Prigozhin betrayed Putin, Putin feels this is somebody whose way of going on is familiar, and somebody who is, if you like, an SOB, but my SOB. Over and above that, Putin just might need certain things that he can't get without ironing out the situation to some degree with Mr. Prigozhin, which is to say that Mr. Putin needs to avoid the sort of warning system going off on this conflict within the pro-war side. If the pro-war side splits too deeply within itself, that could be existential for Putin's rule, he thinks. So to keep the conflict within the pro-war side, caricaturally, we might call that conflict a conflict between the pro-war and the pro-victory side. And a lot of the pro-victory Z radicals are seeing Putin as being not pro-victory but pro-war. To keep that whole show on the rails, to keep it from going off, you may need to engage with Mr. Prigozhin. But we still have to see what happens in Belarus, what happens globally, what happens to Mr. Prigozhin, which of the contracts with the Russian state Mr. Prigozhin loses, all of them, most of them, all of that we have to see. I do promise that book recommendations are coming. While Russian soldiers commit atrocities, how can we ethically, tastefully discuss Russia's mistreatment of conscripts and the potential political consequences? So that's the question I answered, I think, about 20 minutes ago by just saying, let's pluralize our economy of ethical sentiment. It's always both and, not either or, right? unless we're going to be activists, and being an activist is also a completely okay way to be, as long as you understand that's what you're doing and that's what you're going in for. Everybody, I am going to have a little um, I'm seeing questions, and I'm so sorry that we're going to break up at this point. Um, Please, if they're important, come back and batter me with them later. I would love to receive them. Um, I'm gonna go and crash for about an hour, and then I'm gonna spend 2 hours in the gentlest possible way, without taking out any of the pauses, edit a video on the philosophy channel about the meaning of death, which is also to say, of course, the meaning of life. It's going to be about a 10-15 minute video. It's a low effort video, but I think I managed to record it with really, really succeeding in being me communicatively. So I'm going to keep up all the pauses. No, Rachel, we're not breaking up. The beautiful community is till death do us part, from my side at least. So anyway, look forward to seeing you in life and death, probably in a few hours on the philosophy channel. But for now, so kind of you to have been together with me. Um, it is a deal, yes. So kind of you to have been with me. I am very grateful. See you all very, very soon. Bye bye for the moment.